a child, most Jewish scholars think that's a reference to Hezekiah, the birth of Hezekiah. He will be the one to, I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to go there, but you got to give some context. I mean, it's not all agreed upon there. I mean, what the larger machinations of empires rolling over Israel, constantly rolling over Israel. What does it mean to hear a God who speaks through this prophet that says there is a kingdom coming where the lion will lay down with the lamb? Are you buying what this God is selling? What does it mean, you know? And who hasn't had to speak words of hope in a room that wasn't buying what you were selling? I've done a few funerals like that. And I've done a few funerals with children. And I speak words of hope, and I'm not sure I'm believing what I'm sharing. Because there's just some things that hope will come, but not right now. So what does it mean for the people of Isaiah's time to hear these promises about a kingdom that, you know, I don't know, historically perhaps didn't come about in their time and is just now slowly coming about if we are people who follow this Jesus of Nazareth as we believe he told us that this realm was coming. So those are sort of four approaches, and it's a different approach than the ways, but you know, again, these perhaps might be idea starters for you and your journey with these texts. The hard thing, again, is they are so familiar. And to approach them now with to try to not make them familiar, to point out the things. Did you notice in verse 9 in Advent 2, Isaiah 11, the stuff about the evidence? What does that mean? What kind of realm is this God talking about now? So, all right, that's what I'm selling.
Kevin, you are not the king of boring people to death. That was very engaging, and you gave us a lot to jump into. I have two themes I want to begin with, but I suppose the first one I want to talk about is the tension around preaching from the Hebrew Bible and whether or not you link it to the New Testament promises, and if so, how do you do that with integrity? I think of the story of the minister who is giving a children's sermon, and the children are gathered at the front, and they know that always, you know, it's going to come back to Jesus. And so the minister asks the children, you know, what's tiny and collects acorns and is furry and brown and lives in the trees? And a child says, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sounds like a squirrel to me. You know? So I'd love to actually invite our panelists first to jump in on that question of how do you do that with integrity, or can you?
Well, first of all, for me, if I'm preaching on the New Testament text and thinking about how they relate to the Hebrew Bible, I'm going to go to the empire. I'm going to look at the themes of what empire does in the New Testament and how it could be related to what empire is doing in the Hebrew Bible as well. So that's my first off-the-cuff answer. I'm going to talk about empire and talk about how it impacts these texts, and then also try to make parallels between empire of today and how they impact us, and how we can, with integrity, try to bridge these gaps so that we're talking about some kind of parallel theme with these texts.
I think I may, at one point I thought I was going to be an Old Testament scholar until I realized how much I had to study. But I've always been in my thinking growing up that the Old Testament was definitely the fulfillment of the New. And so I've never seen them isolated and not able to transfer one thought to the next. And so for me to really understand how to interpret the New Testament, I must know something about what the issues were and how people struggled with the issue. And so to help people to understand that process from how we began to where we are now is just, for me, a natural necessity and complement.
If I were choosing to preach the text from the Hebrew Bible, I would follow what I think was one of Kevin's initial suggestions, and that is to drive home the fact that these texts were not always ours, that they have a long history before the 1st century CE, and that they had meaning then I'd be inclined to stay with that meaning, perhaps pointing to parallel themes, but to stay primarily with that meaning. Now, if I were preaching the New Testament texts, which interpret the Hebrew Bible text, I would be sure to point out that this is an interpretive process, that these texts provided raw material for them to make sense out of this new experience they were having. It was simply another chapter in an ongoing process in which we still participate.
So I think Kevin was sort of warning us against the too quick comparison, or the sort of like the squirrel story, sort of saying, well, Isaiah, it sure sounds like it's about Isaiah, but, but it must be Jesus, right? And we sort of go too quickly to that. And yet for Jesus and his family and the early Christians who were Jewish, they may well have actually interpreted the events that they were seeing related to these texts that were dear to them, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's a natural way to talk about that. Would anybody like to comment on that relationship between the Isaiah and the gospel promises? All right, the next topic I want to talk about is really around technique and preaching, and who our listeners are. So Ronald Allen has done a lot of really good work on researching how people listen to sermons. Because we tend to think as preachers, how do we preach the sermon that's going to get to everybody? And the reality is everybody out there hears things differently. And so he breaks it up into actually these Aristotelian types of people, But like, I'll give you one example is, in all his research of interviewing people and how they listen to a sermon, there's one group of people who hear a sermon or don't hear it based almost entirely on their relationship with you, the preacher. So if they know you and they love you, you can get up there and say just about anything and they're going to have meaning. And if there's a guest preacher, they're not going to get anything. And if they've had their feelings hurt by you, they're not. Like, these are people who hear and listen in terms of relationship, right? But the other big group is that, most clergy tend to be intuitive idea people, but most people in the pews are sensate, concrete. So we're talking theology and metaphor and story to people who fix sinks and fix cars and are painters and are doctors, but deal in this other kind of concrete world. So I love the introduction of art as a way to get more sensate. What are your reactions to that? And with such an esoteric season like Advent, it's so hard to get your hands around, what could be some ways we could meet the sensate people, the concrete people in the congregation? Open that up to the panel and any of you who would have comments.
I recall while I was pastoring a church on the south side of Richmond, Virginia, a colleague saying that, this was an older, really unofficial mentor in ministry, saying that as a pastor you ought to spend as many hours in visitation as you do in sermon prep. I think those images will come if you know your people. Mm-hmm. And if you have spent the time with them, you've built the relationship, but you will also know their language. You will also know their lives. You will have been permitted to enter into their lives in certain ways. So I think knowing the congregation.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Oh, yes, please.
Many years ago when I first started to preach, I preached a sermon which was not very good, as I recall. And after the worship service, a woman came up to me and she said, I really love what you said about, and then she repeated what she needed to hear, not what I said. Mm-hmm. I know that what she said, I didn't say.
You wish you had.
It was a reminder to me that one of the things that's important, and I think this art thing is it really opens up possibilities here for people seeing something in the art which I wouldn't be able to see because I'm not a student of art, but others would be able to see something there that I could not see. But that was a great reminder to me that I should just let the Holy Spirit do what the Holy Spirit's going to do in spite of me.
Mm-hmm. I think often, those of us in the Reformed Protestant tradition think that the words have to do everything, and so often in preaching we have what I call rabbit holes that people go down, and you could be giving a very well-organized sermon, but you might say something that triggers somebody to go down a rabbit hole. It could be something as simple as, somebody's mother did this, and somebody goes down the rabbit hole of, I'm mad at my mother, and I don't want to see my mother for the holidays, and they're gone for the next 5 minutes, and then they come back, and how do they hook in? And there is something about having visual art there that allows the person to enter back into the story. I had one positive experience one Advent where I was playing with the topic of time, and this will date when I did this, because you'll see it was quite a while ago. But I was doing a series on the topic of time, and that was the focus for Advent. And I handed out little tiny pieces of blue ribbon that I asked everybody to attach to their watches as a reminder that our time is not God's time and how we spend our time matters. Well, of course, today, what's the problem with that? Who's wearing a watch? Yeah, but I'm thinking, what could you do with something like this, that most people look at their phone for? Could you have even a small sticker or something that is blue that you could hand out to people for those who are sensate and want that reminder that's physical? Yeah.
Let me add one thing. Did you want to go ahead first? All right. So let me just add one thing regarding the artwork and sermon prep. For me, I've always been trained in looking at art in biblical studies and in interpretation. So when I talk about finding parallels between issues of empire in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, I also find parallels in the artwork or what the people would have seen in that time. So there's a picture of the gate of Ishtar that leads into Babylon, this beautiful blue gate that basically that people see when they go into Babylon. But I wonder, and when I teach, if I teach anything in Hebrew Bible, I talk about what would it have felt like to walk under this big, blue, beautiful gate, knowing that you're in exile, knowing that you're a captive. And so then I can show an image of that gate and show the beauty of it, but then allow people to think about what does it mean to be in exile as you're going through this beautiful gate. And then to bring that to the New Testament, there are images that we have of Caesar Augustus, the emperor, who basically is a man who embodies all of time, all of the empire, all of the fruits of the empire. And so he is the designated Son of God in Christian times, in the New Testament times. So then when I teach that, I have a picture of Augustus as the Son of God, and then allow people to think about, well, what does it mean to think about Jesus as Son of God in the New Testament? So those pictures of empire juxtaposed against one another are ways to begin to allow artwork to figure into your preaching and how we think about this entire canon of Scripture that we call our Testament, our testaments.
I think you were going to get it.
If you can tell a story, you gather the people. And so I find, my approach is I begin and end with a story in 2013, and then we take the leap into history. But finding the story brings people along. But another thought, when you were talking, my church is extremely relational. So we have this couple, and they sang, and they probably can't sing to the average person, but because of the relationship and the journey and seeing their struggle, when they sang, it sounds so beautiful. Well, a friend of mine was there that day, a visitor, and she said, I don't know what it was they did up there. You know, but I mean, for us, it was powerful. And so it just gets back to what you said about how the relationship will even turn your ear in a way that what you hear is so majestic.
It's like a tuning machine. You know, it makes them sing in tune.
I use visual imagery a lot in my context and in the prayer church where I serve. And just a practical piece about that. When you go to Google Images and you're searching for images, there's a toolbar where you can set the size of the image that you want. Set it to large, so that then whenever you, and don't copy the JPEG, actually click on the image, save that, so that then when you put it on your screen or you put it in your bulletin, it won't be pixelated. Because if the resolution is too small, then whenever you blow it up, it's going to be blurry. And if it's a blurry piece of artwork, it doesn't matter that it's there. And I would also offer...
I just have to interject and say a word from the Lord / probably the one sensate minister in the room. You know, that was so helpful and concrete, and so many of us don't think that way, so thank you. Yeah.
That I never assume that people are going to see what I see in the artwork. And so either engaging in a conversation with people about what do you see, and being sure that then I offer what it is that I see, but always being open to the thing that somebody sees that you have no idea was there, and how that shapes worship.
It also strikes me that to connect with the themes of empire, you know, there's also themes of racism and oppression, and so art can be illuminating, but also art can blind us, right? So I'm looking at the stained glass window over there and seeing, you know, a version of Jesus that probably did not look like Jesus actually looked, you know, and yet that can be a way into having that conversation about the incarnation and the power of the idea that God comes and that we naturally want God to look like us. And so an example is in my church, we have a stained glass window at the back, and it's the only image of Jesus in the building, because it's the congregational tradition, but they put one in the 70s, and it's this blonde-haired Jesus and these 3 little blonde children, and they're wearing little pinafores and sailor suits and knee-high socks and clogs, and it's called, like, you know, Gather the Children, and I affectionately call the window Jesus and the Little Dutch Children, and I can make fun of it, right? Because obviously that's not what anybody was wearing or looked like in first century Palestine, but the window was given by a family who had lost a child, who is around the age of those children in the picture. And I'm guessing that it was very powerful for them to imagine these children that looked like their child being gathered in by Jesus. And similarly, there's some amazing examples of Madonnas and children that represent all different cultures. And one just to throw out, there was a church in Israel that is filled with these huge paintings of the Madonna and the Child, and each one is done by an artist from a different country. And I tell you what, there's nothing like seeing a Madonna who is dressed in an ornate silk kimono, you know, and a Japanese baby Jesus, to sort of shake you up and realize that the incarnation is about meeting us, and that art can be a really revolutionary tool in unpacking some of that. So we're going to stop for now, and yes?
The University Adventist School website, which is where we listed the Advent text, they have also a parallel art.
Oh, how wonderful. How wonderful. Okay, so we're going to break for now, and we will come back at 1:30 to be illuminated by the New Testament. Thank you.